My name is Natalie Gibbs, and I ruined my life with a calculator in hand and a heart full of resentment. That's not how I saw it at the time, of course. Back then, I thought I was being strategic, practical, looking out for myself and my daughter because no one else would. I met Robert during my second year of community college. I was 20, waiting tables and taking night classes, and he was 24, fresh out of nursing school with student loans and big dreams of eventually going back for his nurse practitioner license. We got married after dating for 18 months, had our daughter Emma 2 years later, and settled into what I'd call a comfortable but uninspiring existence in a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the outskirts of Ridgemont. For the first several years, I was happy enough. Robert worked long shifts at County General, climbing from regular floor nurse to ER charge nurse. I finished my associate's degree, had Emma, and found part-time work as a bank teller that fit around Robert's schedule, so we rarely needed childcare. We weren't wealthy, but we made it work. Looking back, I can pinpoint exactly when things changed. Emma was 8, and we attended a neighborhood barbecue at the Wilsons' new house, a gorgeous 2-story colonial with a sprawling backyard that made our place look like a storage shed. Carol Wilson pulled me aside while the kids played in their above-ground pool. Richard's firm just made him partner, she whispered, refilling my plastic cup with surprisingly decent Chardonnay. We're thinking of joining the country club next spring. She said it casually, like she was mentioning picking up milk at the store. I smiled and congratulated her, but something sour unfolded in my stomach. That night, I looked around our living room, the second-hand furniture, the carpet with stubborn stains from when Emma was a toddler, the walls we kept meaning to repaint, and felt a crushing wave of disappointment. Do you ever think about what our lives would be like if you'd become a doctor instead of a nurse? I asked Robert as he folded laundry, fresh off a 12-hour shift. He looked up, puzzled. Not really. Why? The Wilsons just bought that huge house. He's a partner at his firm now. Robert shrugged. Good for them. Richard works 80-hour weeks and barely sees his kids. That's not what I want. But we could have had more, done more, been more. The words came out sharper than I intended. He set down the towel he was folding. I thought we were doing okay. Are you unhappy, Nat? I should have been honest then. Said yes, I was unhappy. But not because of him, because of me, because I'd started measuring our life against others and found it wanting. Instead, I said, I'm just tired of struggling. We're not struggling, he said quietly. We're living within our means. That was the beginning of the end, though neither of us knew it yet. 6 months later, I met Warren Blackwell at a local Chamber of Commerce mixer I attended for the bank. He was 42, divorced, no children, and owned 3 successful urgent care centers across the county. He wore a watch that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment and drove a Tesla. When he asked for my card, I felt a flutter that had nothing to do with potential business for the bank. What followed was textbook. Coffee meetings to discuss financial services for his business turned into lunch meetings. Lunch meetings extended into evening drinks. He complimented everything from my financial insights to the way I styled my hair. Meanwhile, at home, I picked fights with Robert about overtime shifts, about the vacations we couldn't afford, about Emma's need for braces that our insurance only partially covered. I started working longer hours myself, volunteering for evening bank events I knew Warren might attend. Robert, exhausted from his own work schedule, barely noticed. He trusted me completely, which made what came next both easier and infinitely worse. The affair with Warren was intoxicating, not just the sex, but the glimpse into another life. Dinners at restaurants where entrees cost more than our weekly grocery budget. Weekend trips I covered with women's retreats and bank conferences. A taste of the lifestyle I'd convinced myself I deserved. Warren never explicitly promised to leave his current girlfriend for me, but he strongly implied it. Once your situation changes, he'd say, trailing fingers down my arm, we can explore what this could really be. I heard what I wanted to hear. I consulted a divorce attorney in June, secretly, using cash withdrawn in small increments so it wouldn't raise flags on our joint account. What I learned was sobering. Robert, despite his modest nurse's salary, had been diligently saving for retirement since before we met. He had a 401k, a separate investment account, and had recently inherited $40,000 from his grandmother that he'd invested rather than spent. In our state's equitable distribution laws, I'd be entitled to roughly half of our marital assets. But the lawyer warned me that judges tended to look unfavorably on the spouse initiating divorce without clear fault from the other party. If there's any evidence of emotional abuse, excessive control over finances, or behavior that might negatively impact your daughter, that could shift things significantly in your favor, she explained. Not quite suggesting I manufacture such evidence, but certainly opening the door. I left her office with the seed planted. If Robert had been a drinker, or had a temper, or cheated, anything that made him the villain, this would be so much easier. But he wasn't, and he hadn't. He was just ordinary, dependable, unambitious in the ways I had come to resent. Warren became more insistent. "You can't expect me to wait forever, Natalie," he said during a weekend in Vermont, while his girlfriend thought he was at a medical conference. "I need to know you're serious about making changes." I filed for divorce the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. Robert was blindsided. He begged for counseling, for a chance to work things out. When I refused, his confusion turned to hurt, then to a quiet resignation that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I don't understand what happened to us," he said, voice hollow, the night he moved his things to a small apartment near the hospital. "I thought we were building something together." Emma, then 11, was devastated. She adored her father, who despite his work schedule had never missed a dance recital or parent-teacher conference. She couldn't comprehend why he was suddenly living elsewhere, why I insisted she stay primarily with me, why her world had imploded. This is where my story gets ugly, the part I've spent years trying to justify to myself. In the preliminary divorce hearings, it became clear that Robert's financial discipline would likely result in me getting less than I'd hoped. The judge seemed inclined to grant joint physical custody, meaning no significant child support. Robert had documentation of every contribution he'd made to our household, every overtime shift he'd worked to provide extras for Emma, every financial sacrifice. Meanwhile, Warren had become noticeably distant, canceling plans and taking longer to return my messages. When I drove past one of his clinics one evening and saw his Tesla parked next to a red Audi, I recognized as belonging to his office manager, I knew I was being phased out. Panic set in. I stood to lose not just Warren, but also the financial security I'd counted on from the divorce settlement. In desperation, I did the unthinkable. I began systematically turning Emma against her father. It started subtly. I'd forget to tell Robert about Emma's activities until the last minute, ensuring he'd have to choose between disappointing her by missing events or scrambling to rearrange his work schedule. When he inevitably missed something, I'd sigh to Emma, "I guess Dad's work is more important right now, sweetie." I began questioning his parenting decisions in front of her. "Dad let you stay up until 11? That's why you're so tired and cranky today." Or, "Dad took you to McDonald's again? No wonder your stomach hurts." When Emma would return from weekends with him, I'd interrogate her about what they did, who they saw, subtly implying there might be something inappropriate about his new apartment or friends. If she mentioned a female neighbor or coworker, I'd raise an eyebrow. "Oh, did Dad seem friendly with her?" The most shameful part came when I realized that in our state, a child's testimony about feeling unsafe or uncomfortable with a parent could significantly impact custody arrangements. I never explicitly told Emma to lie. I want to be clear about that. But I created an environment where she felt she needed to protect me, to choose sides. "You know, Emma," I said one evening after she returned from Robert's, "if you ever feel scared or uncomfortable at Dad's apartment, you can tell me. Or tell the nice lady at the courthouse when we go next month." "Why would I feel scared with Dad?" she asked, confused. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes adults don't realize how their behavior affects children. Like when Dad gets frustrated and raises his voice, that can be scary for someone your age. "Dad doesn't yell at me," she said, but I could see the seed of doubt. Maybe not yelling, but you know how he gets when he's tired after shifts. Remember that time he slammed the cabinet door when you kept asking him questions during dinner? You were upset that night. It was a reference to a single incident years earlier when Robert had indeed closed a cabinet door harder than usual after a particularly grueling shift involving a child casualty. He'd immediately apologized and spent the rest of the evening making it up to Emma. But in my retelling, it became part of a pattern, one of many incidents where he'd lost control and frightened her. Over the weeks leading up to our court date, I systematically rewrote our family history, casting Robert's rare moments of human imperfection as threatening behavior. I emphasized how much more peaceful our home was without him, how Emma seemed less anxious now that she didn't have to walk on eggshells around his moods. Emma, desperate to please me and confused by the conflicting narratives of a father she loved and a mother she trusted, gradually adopted my version of events. By the time our custody hearing arrived, she had a manufactured collection of concerning incidents, ready to share when interviewed by the court-appointed guardian ad litem. I'll never forget Robert's face when the gal's report was presented, detailing Emma's apparent fear of his unpredictable moods and intimidating behavior. He looked at me across the courtroom with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and dawning comprehension that made my stomach turn. In that moment, he knew exactly what I'd done. His attorney requested a recess, and when we returned, everything had changed. Robert, pale and tight-lipped, announced through his counsel that he would not contest primary physical custody. In exchange, he asked for minimal child support obligations and to retain his retirement accounts and investments in full. His attorney made it clear that Robert could fight the allegations. They had character witnesses ready, including colleagues who had seen him remain calm during literal life-and-death emergencies, but that he wouldn't put Emma through the trauma of a prolonged custody battle. The judge, after reviewing the gal's report and hearing Robert's concession, granted me primary custody with Robert having visitation every other weekend. I received the house, but none of his retirement or investment accounts. Given the circumstances, it was presented as a generous settlement on Robert's part. I should have felt victorious. Instead, as I watched Robert walk out of the courtroom without looking back, something cold settled in my chest. 2 weeks later, Warren ended things officially, having apparently rekindled things with his ex-wife. Perfect timing, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're both free now. When I mentioned my divorce was finalized, he looked uncomfortable. About that, Melissa and I have actually decided to try again. These things happen for a reason, right? I was alone, with a mortgage I could barely afford on my bank salary, a daughter who was increasingly withdrawn, and an ex-husband who had gone from devoted father to distant stranger in the span of months. Robert followed the visitation schedule to the letter for exactly 6 months. He never arrived late, never returned Emma early, never created conflicts. But something fundamental had broken. Emma would return from his apartment quiet and subdued. When I asked what they did, her answers became increasingly brief. Nothing much. Watched movies. Then, a week before Christmas, Robert requested a meeting at a coffee shop near his apartment. He arrived in a suit I'd never seen, looking both more professional and more distant than the man I'd been married to for 12 years. I've accepted a position with a medical relief organization, he said, without preamble. I'll be working overseas for at least 2 years, possibly longer. You can't just abandon Emma, I protested, panic rising. Without his child support, however minimal, my financial situation would become even more precarious. I'm not abandoning her. I'm removing myself from a situation that's become poisonous. His voice was calm, but glacial. I'll continue to send the court-mandated support payments. I'll email Emma weekly and video chat when possible, given the time differences. But I can't stay here and watch what's happening. What's that supposed to mean? You know exactly what it means, Natalie. It was the first time he'd used my full name rather than Nat since our earliest dating days. You turned our daughter into a weapon. I won't subject either of us to that environment anymore. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was documentation of his new position, a schedule of when he'd attempt to contact Emma, and routing information for his continued support payments. "You're punishing me," I said, my voice rising, drawing glances from nearby tables. "No," he replied, standing to leave. "I'm protecting myself. Something I should have done much sooner." 2 days later, he was gone. True to his word, the support payments arrived like clockwork. He emailed Emma regularly and arranged video calls when possible. But he never returned to Ridgemont, not even when his mother became ill the following year. He sent his younger brother in his place, with instructions to keep Emma away from any family discussions of his whereabouts or activities. Emma, initially upset by her father's departure, eventually settled into a routine of distant digital contact with him. As she entered her teen years, she became increasingly self-sufficient and emotionally reserved, especially with me. The closeness I'd expected to develop once Robert was out of the picture never materialized. Instead, she spent more time with friends, with school activities, even with Robert's mother, anywhere but home. 4 years passed in this holding pattern. I dated sporadically, but nothing serious developed. My bank job provided stability, but little opportunity for advancement without the degree I'd never completed. The house needed repairs I couldn't afford. Emma, now 15, had become a stranger who happened to live under my roof. Then came the Facebook post that changed everything. Karen Sullivan, whose daughter had been in dance classes with Emma years earlier, shared a news article about a field hospital in Sudan, where medical staff were providing critical care during a regional conflict. In the accompanying photo, there was Robert, older, tanned, focused as he worked alongside other medical personnel. The article mentioned him by name, noting his instrumental role in establishing protocols that had saved countless lives, and his recent acceptance of a position as medical director for the entire regional operation. I stared at the image, trying to reconcile this accomplished professional with the man I'd dismissed as unambitious. Out of morbid curiosity, I searched his name online and found more articles, mentions in medical journals, even a TED Talk he'd given about emergency medicine in conflict zones. When Emma returned from school that day, I casually mentioned seeing her father in the news. "Did you know what he's been doing?" I asked, aiming for conversational but hearing the tension in my own voice. She nodded without looking up from her homework. "He mentioned the promotion when we talked last week. He's coming back to the States for a medical conference next month. I'm going to meet him in Chicago." "He never mentioned that to me," I said, stung. "Why would he?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact, which somehow hurt more. The trip to Chicago became a point of contention. I initially refused permission, citing school responsibilities, the cost, the impropriety of a 15-year-old traveling alone. Emma simply shrugged and said, "Then I'll wait until I'm 18. It's only 3 more years." Something in her calm certainty made me realize I was losing what little relationship we still had. I relented, and Emma spent 4 days in Chicago with the father she hadn't seen in person for 4 years. She returned with a new phone for schoolwork, clothes from stores I couldn't afford, and a quieter, more determined demeanor. When I asked about the visit, she shared polite, superficial details. Yes, they'd gone to the museum. Yes, his hotel was nice. No, they hadn't discussed me. It was the beginning of Emma's gradual but unmistakable shift away from my influence. She began spending school breaks with Robert's mother, helping the older woman with house maintenance and garden work. She joined a hospital volunteer program, working evenings and weekends in the same ER where Robert had once been charge nurse. She opened a bank account for her earnings without adding me as a co-signer. By the time she was 17, college applications became another battlefield. I pushed for state schools where my employee discount might help with tuition. Emma applied to those, but also to schools in Chicago and Baltimore, where I later learned Robert had connections through his medical relief work. The acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins arrived with a substantial merit scholarship, that still left a significant financial gap. Before I could explain why it wasn't feasible, Emma calmly informed me that her father had offered to cover the remainder. "We can't accept that," I said automatically, though we both knew I had no alternative to offer. "I already did," she replied. "I'm 18 next month. I can make my own decisions." It was the closest she'd come to outright defiance. She held my gaze until I looked away first, recognizing the immovable determination she'd inherited from both her parents. The summer before Emma left for college, Robert returned to the United States permanently, having accepted a position as emergency medicine director at a prestigious hospital in Baltimore, conveniently near where Emma would be studying. They didn't announce this to me directly. I discovered it when helping Emma pack and finding a lease agreement for an apartment with her name listed as a secondary occupant. The primary name on the lease was Robert's. "You're living with your father?" I asked, holding the document, feeling as though I'd been ambushed. "Only during breaks. He bought a condo with a guest room for me," she continued, folding clothes as if this weren't "When were you going to tell me this?" she shrugged. "I'm telling you now." "Emma, after everything—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. "We're not doing this again." "Doing what?" She finally looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. "You know what, Mom? The same thing you did when I was 11, trying to make Dad the villain." My mouth went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." She sat on the edge of her bed, suddenly looking both much older and much younger than her 18 years. "I've remembered things over time. Things you told me to say. Things you made me believe that weren't true. Dad never talked about it. He refused to say anything negative about you, actually, but I figured it out. Emma, you were a child. Your memories are actually pretty clear," she finished for me. "Clear enough that 3 years ago, I wrote down everything I could remember about the divorce, the court stuff, the things you coached me to say. I gave that journal to Dad when I saw him in Chicago. He cried when he read it. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Why would you do that? Because I needed to know the truth, and because he deserved an apology, even if it didn't come from you." I sat heavily in her desk chair, trying to process what she was saying. "So the past 3 years, this distance between us, has been me figuring out how to have relationships with both my parents when one of them tried to destroy the other." Her voice was steady, but not cruel. "I don't hate you, Mom, but I don't trust you either." The day we drove Emma to college was excruciating. Robert met us in the dormitory parking lot, looking successful and at ease in a way I barely recognized. He helped carry boxes, chatted with roommates' parents, played the role of supportive father flawlessly. He was polite to me, but distant, his eyes never quite meeting mine. As move-in day wound down, Emma hugged me briefly in the parking lot. "I'll call on Sundays," she promised, already pulling away. To Robert, she gave a longer embrace, whispering something that made him smile and squeeze her tighter. I drove home alone to an emptier house than I'd ever imagined. That was 2 years ago. Emma is now a junior, thriving academically and socially from what I can tell from our brief weekly calls. She spent last summer interning at Robert's hospital and traveling with him to a medical conference in London. She's never stayed at my house for longer than a weekend since leaving for college. Robert, according to his mother, who has become surprisingly forthcoming now that the damage is done, has not only excelled professionally, but has recently become engaged to a pediatric surgeon he met through his relief work. They've purchased land outside Baltimore and are building what his mother describes as their dream home, with a separate guest house where Emma can stay after graduation while attending medical school. The modest support payments stopped when Emma turned 18. My house needs a new roof I can't afford. The bank where I've worked for 15 years announced downsizing last month. At 42, I find myself facing an uncertain future alone, watching from a distance as my ex-husband and daughter build a life that no longer includes me. Sometimes I drive past the old neighborhoods where we used to live as a family, remembering the ordinary moments I once found so insufficient. Weekend breakfast with Robert making his famous pancakes, family movie nights with Emma between us on the couch, holiday gatherings that seemed boring, but were filled with a quiet contentment I failed to recognize. In my darkest moments, I wonder what life might have been like if I'd approached Robert honestly about my dissatisfaction. If we'd sought counseling, if I'd focused on building something meaningful instead of resenting what others had. I wonder if we might have grown together rather than irrevocably apart. I wonder if I might still have a genuine relationship with my daughter instead of the polite distance that now exists between us. The greatest irony, the one that keeps me awake on long nights, is that I orchestrated all of this in pursuit of financial security and status, only to end up with neither. Meanwhile, Robert, who never chased wealth or recognition, has achieved both through simply doing work he found meaningful. I'd like to say I've learned from this, that I've become a better person through losing everything that actually mattered. The truth is messier. There are still days I feel justified in what I did. Days I tell myself I was just trying to secure a better future for Emma and myself. There are other days the shame is so overwhelming I can barely look at myself in the mirror. What I know with certainty is this. In trying to win everything in the short term, I lost everything that would have sustained me in the long run. My daughter's trust. The possibility of building a life based on something more substantial than comparison and resentment. If there's a lesson here, maybe it's simply that the scorched earth you create to defeat your perceived enemies eventually becomes the ground you yourself must stand upon. And nothing grows in those ashes, no matter how desperately you might wish it would.